So in the last decade or so, India has had a number of private universities along the model of American-style undergraduate four-year colleges. So one of the most prominent universities is a university called Ashoka University. And the idea was that it's going to be a comprehensive liberal arts university. Recently, with this India-Pakistan conflict, a Muslim professor from Ashoka, had just made a couple of innocuous tweets, which were about the government of India in the name of nationalism is trotting out Muslims to echo its message, something to that effect, about pointing to the hypocrisy of the government in its treatment of Muslims at different points of time. And he mystifyingly was arrested for spreading communal discord or hate or being anti-national or something absurd. Students of Ashoka and his colleagues have spoken out in his defense. And the founder, I think he's a corporate guy or some entrepreneur who made a lot of money, has come out with the most absurd article saying that, we should stay neutral and it's not for us. And if students aren't allowed to speak their mind at a university that claims to represent critical thinking, what does one even say?
This is the Rhyme and Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what's happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa just before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era, just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015.
I'm Maria Revnikova. My Jewish Belarusian grandmother is a Holocaust survivor. I grew up in post-Soviet Latvia and immigrated to America with my mom and brother as a teenager. I've studied in China and Russia for nearly 2 decades. I have been living in Atlanta, Georgia, where I teach at university since 2016. Today, we're really happy to be speaking to Rohit Chopra, who is professor in the Department of Communication at Santa Clara University. His research centers on global media and cultural identity, new media, and media and memory, with a focus on global Hindu nationalist and far-right online communities.
Rohit is the author of The Gita for a Global World, Ethical Action in an Age of Flux, and Technology and Nationalism in India, Cultural Negotiations from Colonialism to Cyberspace. Welcome to Rhyme and Chaos, Rohit.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before we begin, we're going to be talking about a lot of Indian places, people, and political parties that may be unfamiliar to some of our listeners. We've put a brief glossary of the important ones in the show notes. So, since independence and the end of British colonial rule in 1947, Indian politics has been dominated by the Indian National Congress Party, or the Congress, which itself has been dominated by the heroes of Indian independence, Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and their family. Congress began life as a socialist party, but in recent decades gradually became more neoliberal capitalist in its outlook. It's a Big Tent party, secular and open to minorities and different political views. Is that about right, Rohit? And if it is, it sounds too wonderful. What explains the rise of Hindu nationalism and current Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP party?
There are elements of truth to that description, but I suspect it's the description of the Congress that the Congress would like to give of itself. So the Congress has had a bit of a mixed record in terms of its commitment to secularism. Its roots are significantly secular, if not wholly secular. The relationship between mainstream or secular nationalism and Hindu nationalism is actually more complicated than the official narrative of the Congress-helmed Indian state would have you believe. Nonetheless, despite the Congress sort of claiming to hold the mantle of secularism, it was, I would say, largely a secular party with some aberrations. Similarly, it was committed to democracy, even if that democracy took a populist turn, with the exception of the emergency. Internally, it wasn't always the most democratic party because of the tendency towards dynastic rule of the Nehru-Gandhi family. But there is a significant difference, given the warts and all legacy of the Congress, between the Congress and the Hindu right, the BJP as such. Now, what explains the rise of the Hindu nationalist movement? In the decades after India's independence, the Hindu right, the RSS, was marginalized, not least because the person who assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, Nathuram Godse, was associated with the RSS. The RSS has always denied he was a member of the RSS, but he was seen as belonging to the Hindu right. The RSS was banned also by India's, Home Minister Sardar Patel in the aftermath of independence and so on. And then it was, I'd say, sort of relegated to the sidelines as a movement. The RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which was founded in 1925, is a cultural organization. It's always described itself as being interested not in politics, with the BJP being the political wing of the Hindu right movement. And the BJP was founded, not till 1980. Now, what happens is that despite the Congress going out of power when Indira Gandhi declared an emergency and elections were held, she came back, after the Janata Party that replaced the Congress had a very short-lived reign.
And when was this? What years was this taking place?
The emergency was 1975. And, 1977, Congress was, I think, sort of very convincingly defeated. But then after that, it came back in the next sort of general election. The Janata Party, and some of that energy of the Janata Party eventually kind of transmuted into what would become the BJP. The BJP had a kind of predecessor, and then as a political party, it was formed in, I think, 1980. But so there's a couple of things to think about. One is that even if officially secularism was, the professed ideology of the Congress, and Nehruvian secularism as it is known was sort of identified with the image of the Indian state, or the ruling ideology, the governing ideology, if you will call it, communal sentiment, what's called sectarian sentiment. Communal is a particular term that, means sectarian in the Indian context. Sectarian sentiment still hadn't completely been eradicated. Independent India did see, I'd say, a significant number of interreligious riots, and there was interreligious conflict. And in the 1980s, there's a couple of things that happen. In the 1980s, that's when the Hindu right starts staging a kind of comeback, both gaining broader cultural legitimacy as well as political legitimacy. So one incident was, there are two or three things. One is the Hindu right and then the BJP start really turning this idea of the Babri Masjid, the mosque that was built by Babur, who, invaded India in the 1520s and established the Mughal dynasty. There's a mosque named after him. And it's a mosque that's been disputed since at least the 19th century.
That's because it was built on the top of what had been a Hindu temple.
Allegedly. There's no conclusive evidence for it.
That's what people say.
Yes. And I think the historical consensus and the archaeological consensus is that there is no proof, definitive proof, that there was a temple there. But it's not just any temple. What made it particularly controversial was the Hindu right claim that that temple was the birthplace of the Hindu deity Lord Ram, who is very, very central as a sort of a religious figure and to the lives of, millions, if not hundreds of millions of Hindus. So this issue, which had been sort of simmering since the 19th century, but I would say it had still been contained as a kind of local issue. This became the basis on which to construct this and to promote this BJP or this Hindu right idea of India as essentially a Hindu country, of Muslims as the descendants of invaders and outsiders and aliens, and, scaffold a number of stereotypes such as Muslims as being inherently violent, wanting to dominate Hindus and so on. So that was one major event. The second event was the Shah Banu case. Now, I just want to get into a little bit of detail here. In India, different religious communities are allowed to follow and have been allowed since independence to follow what is called personal law, their own religious laws or customary laws in affairs to do with marriage, inheritance, and so on. And the Shah Banu controversy was essentially a Muslim woman seeking alimony when her husband had divorced her using triple talaq. Triple talaq is the idea where if you just say talaq, which means divorce 3 times, you can divorce your wife. And Muslims in India, by customary law, Muslim men are allowed to have 4 wives. Every community is allowed to follow its own personal laws, but one of the arguments that the Hindu right, but also others have made, is that in certain respects, the Muslim community is more quote-unquote backward than other communities. And this reveals the hypocrisy of Indian secularism. This is a reflection of appeasement of Muslims, etc. Now, a Supreme Court of India ruled that Shah Banu was entitled to maintenance under Indian law, and Muslims came out to protest in large numbers. And in 1986, the Rajiv Gandhi government actually passed a new law which essentially negated what the Supreme Court had ruled. And this gave fodder to the Hindu right that the Congress party panders to Muslims. And after that, the Congress government itself allowed the locks of the Babri Masjid. It was not open to the public, but after that, they allowed Hindus to start offering prayers at the site of the Babri Masjid. So a couple of things happen here. One is that it reinforces the idea of Muslims as backward and of the idea of the Congress as appeasing Muslims. And the second, the Congress, interestingly, and not so much, not the BJP, actually allow Hindus to start worshipping at the Babri Masjid. It's seen as a concession to the Hindus, given what they did in the Babri Masjid case. So these are two, I think, really important turning points that mark the gradual return of the BJP, the Hindu right and the BJP, to the national political center stage.
Thank you so much for this fascinating account, Rohit. I was curious about the rise of Modi himself. Could you tell us a little bit more about the man and how we should understand him, and maybe if it carries some resemblances of Donald Trump for you as you are observing what's happening in the United States?
Sure. So Modi is, I think a historian has said there are no exact historical parallels, but there are some interesting similarities. Modi is an interesting figure. He was raised in the RSS. He was chief minister of the state of Gujarat, and he managed to very effectively convey an impression of being a highly efficient administrator in Gujarat. The reality is a lot more complex. It's the same kind of myth that you see now being promoted by his fans and his fanboys and fangirls, and those who need to pander to his ego, that Modi's an amazing leader, etc., etc. So there was talk of this Gujarat miracle, that he had made the state highly efficient, he had weeded out corruption, he was a strong leader, but essentially his rule was autocratic. It was marked by really attacks on minorities. A lot of, the success story and the economic miracle of Gujarat doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Now, Modi was at the center of a controversy when in 2002, at a number of what are called kar sevaks, which are pilgrims, who are returning from the site of the disputed temple at Ayodhya. 58 of them were burnt alive in a train at a station in Godhra, in Gujarat. And the exact circumstances about what happened, there was some conflict between Muslims who worked at the station. I think they were vendors. But whether it was Muslims who were responsible for the burning of the train, how exactly the train compartment caught fire, there's been some very good journalistic work showing that none of that is very clear. It's all very murky. But 58 pilgrims were killed. And what happened is that Hindu mobs in the state went on a bloody riot, a kind of pogrom against Muslims. And the story goes that Modi allowed this to happen on his watch and said that, essentially said something to the effect that Muslims need to be taught a lesson. And because of this was accepted enough to the point, nationally and internationally, where Modi became a national pariah. He was almost thrown out of the BJP by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the Indian Prime Minister then. And he kind of managed not to by the skin of his teeth. There's a whole other story about that. Modi was, as a result, denied a visa to enter the United States. So he was a pariah and he was on the margins of Indian politics. Cut forward. So 1999, to 2004, you have a BJP government led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, which doesn't come back to power. They sell this narrative, and the slogan at that point of time was India Shining. They don't come back to power. The Congress comes back to power, the United Progressive Alliance coalition government spearheaded by the Congress with Dr. Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister. They get one term, they get a second term as well. By the second term, there's, I think, the anti-incumbency factor. The Congress is seen as jaded. What starts happening around this time, I think, is starting around 2011-12. I think there is a think tank, or there is a brains trust of the Hindu right, which realizes that Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva as it's called, is not going to be the basis on which an election can be run. And they really start focusing on corruption as an issue. By this time, Manmohan Singh is seen as accurately or inaccurately as a kind of puppet prime minister, a puppet of Sonia Gandhi, of the Congress party. The Congress is guilty of a certain arrogance and high-handedness, and perhaps of a certain degree of corruption, which is standard across administration. Certainly, it's nothing compared to the corruption we've seen in the Modi regime. And a couple of the cases on the basis of which a kind of mass hysteria almost about corruption was whipped up. Now we know that they were completely fabricated.
That does sound a little like the United States. I mean, all the kerfuffle about Joe Biden's son, about Hunter Biden. And meanwhile, now we have this corruption on a scale so grand, nobody can even keep track of the sums.
Absolutely. I think so. Those, I think, are very interesting parallels. The second parallel I would basically say is that Modi has this ability, like Trump, to portray himself as a kind of man of the people, right? There's this whole narrative about Modi being a kind of saint. He's not a family man. Modi, he sort of walked out on his wife, as it were. He doesn't have children. So the idea is that Modi is enormously selfless, right? And that resonates with a large number of people across different social groups. Just as Trump, despite being born with the proverbial silver spoon, has managed to make himself out to be this sort of voice of the masses. The third sort of interesting parallel is that both of them are able to use media very effectively, but yet they are able to use it in a manner that seems unmediated. Although with Modi, I think that illusion again has sort of shattered somewhat. And finally, I would say that both have a instrumental understanding of democracy as just a kind of means to stay in power. And they have managed to, I think, persuade large numbers of followers that democracy is something at the end of the day that just serves elites, but you have to go above democracy in the name of some kind of higher truth or higher principle of justice.
Right, yeah. That's very uncomfortable similarities. What is the fundamental claim of the Hindu right, and how would you compare it with the American Christian right?
So the Hindu right, the claim essentially is that India is a Hindu country, Hindu in its ethos. Its most authentic citizens are Hindus. And though the BJP claims to, and to some extent walks the talk, but not entirely, represent all Hindus across castes and classes, it tends to valorize a privileged caste Hindu viewpoint. So the claim is that that's, what gives India its character. India is a Hindu country, and the modern nation state should reflect that, even if constitutionally it continues to be a secular republic. Minorities, particularly Muslims and Christians, are seen as outsiders because their allegiance, as members of religious communities, lie elsewhere. And Muslims, more than Christians, I would say, are the target of this narrative, but Christians as well. I think in the US, my sense is that, there is a Christian right, but I think if you look at the right or the far right that supports Donald Trump, the Christian right probably doesn't dominate it, or religion doesn't play as prominent a role as Hinduism does in the Indian right or the Hindu right. The religious aspect occupies almost entirely the sort of right-wing nationalist space in India. Whereas I think even, not counting traditional conservatives or right-wingers, even looking at sort of the far right, MAGA, the natalist movement, some of these strange kind of subgroups, there's a kind of element of racial supremacy which is not necessarily Christian. And then there's Christian supremacy, which is not necessarily racialized. And then there are the Christian and the racial supremacists. And then there are the MAGAs, and then there are the, former Bernie bros who have, after being influenced by Joe Rogan and the like come over to Trump. So I think it is prominent, but it's not as prominent as the religious right in the Indian context.
And aside from the US, do you see any linkages between the Hindu rights and right-wing movements in the rest of the world or other contexts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things is I think we've seen a rightward shift everywhere. And the reasons for that, sociologists, economists, political scientists, historians would be, I think, very well placed to explain. It's up for grabs. Is it a backlash against perceived negative impacts of globalization, for instance, right? There's a couple of interesting pieces I read, I forget by who now. We are deglobalizing. That globalization has not sort of delivered on its promises, is the end of neoliberalism, inequality is rampant, so people are looking for excuses. So whatever the factors are, in the European context, I definitely think that part of it is a backlash to migration. Similarly, migration is a kind of issue here as well. So the two or three things that I think are in common, one is that there is an obsession again with some kind of national purity, right? The idea of who the sort of real citizens of a place are, which is so central. That idea is always kind of implicit, inherent in nationalism, right? And that sits uneasily with the idea of even secular, egalitarian, democratic nation states. That ultimately, England belongs to the English who are white, and or that America belongs to white Americans, or that India belongs to Hindus, and so on. So the emphasis on national purity sometimes coincides with a particular religion. Sometimes it coincides with ethnic purity, sometimes with racial purity. The second thing is that I think because of global media, and in no mean measure because of the internet, that these movements have started influencing each other in all kinds of very interesting ways. So they borrow themes and tropes from each other. And in very sort of direct terms, so Israel and the model of Zionism has long been a kind of cherished model for the Hindu right. And then the Hindu right now has started influencing far-right movements in other parts of the world. So Anders Breivik, right, the Norwegian who was engaged in the mass killing and was found with white supremacist manifestos, deeply influenced by the Hindu right. There's a very trashy propagandist Indian news outlet. I wouldn't call it news. It's a propaganda outlet called Op India, which doesn't even deny that it just lies outright. And their editor, Nupur Sharma, had a long conversation with Tommy Robinson, for instance, and described him very charmingly as a misunderstood man. And not a racist at all.
Right. He might feel differently if he was wandering down a dark alley somewhere in England and encountered Tommy Robinson instead of on a podcast.
Absolutely. That was my exact thought about her. That, one of the supporters of Tommy Robinson is probably, likely not to see things the same way if he encountered you on the tube or on a street in England.
Has the Hindu right gone global? I mean, I know when Modi was here in the United States, he had quite a good crowd the last time he was here for one of his events. How global is it? And how does that function?
Oh, yes, it's very much a global movement. I think it's important to sort of bear in mind that there are certain emphases it has and certain goals it has which are very nationally centered. India still continues to be central. But yes, it's been global at least since the 1980s. One of the things that the Hindu right did very well from the post-independence period onwards is that it understood the importance of the diaspora very early. And it's a lovely book on India called The Idea of India by the scholar Sunil Khilnani. And he points out that for Nehru, for instance, the focus was in India. And I think maybe it's not Khilnani, but someone else who says that for Indians who had emigrated to other parts of the world, Nehru's argument always was, go be good citizens of the countries you live in. But the Hindu right, the RSS, they established, I think, starting in Kenya, they've established sort of these Hindu cultural centers and branches. Their overseas wing is called the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, the HSS. And the VHP, the World Hindu Council, or the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, also started, I think, the 60s onwards, establishing branches in many countries. So they have a presence in dozens of countries. And after India, the RSS, the largest number of branches are in the US. So they've been reaching to these different diasporic communities since at least the 1960s. From the 1980s onwards, the temple became this cause around which the BJP was able to, or the Hindu right was able to raise significant funds. And some of those funds were actually siphoned off by one Hindu right organization, I remember. But they raised tens of millions of dollars from wealthy expatriate Indians, non-resident Indians in the UK and in the US. In the 1990s, after the invention of the World Wide Web, when the internet became central to a lot of this, most Hindu nationalist, Hindu right websites were actually hosted on servers in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley and the wealthy tech and professional communities in the Bay Area where I live have long been a source of support for the Hindu right. A few years ago, I was part of an organizing committee for a conference, called the Global Hindutva Conference. And you had groups like the Hindu American Foundation, that's actually a far-right group, and others orchestrating a campaign against that particular conference, even as television anchors on propagandist mainstream channels in India were screaming and ranting and raving. And they developed a sort of template for turning in complaints, and 1 million emails were received in protest. And at some point of time, one of the universities, this was jointly organized by by over 80 academic centers at over 50 universities globally, most of which are in America. But one university, Drew University, its servers crashed because it received 30,000 emails in a minute. So that's the level of organization. There's a fantastic report that came out a year or two ago about the sums of money, tens of millions of dollars that flow, that have been repatriated from the US to Hindu right-wing causes in India. I think about $59 million, I think, just in about 8 years, from something like, 2010 to 2020 or 2011 to 2021. The author of the report is Jasa Macher, Jasamacher, which is a pseudonym. So it is a very well-oiled global machine, and they continue to sort of cultivate it. The Congress let slip that opportunity. And even now, when you have these attacks on people who are perceived to be critics of Modi or the BJP or the Hindu right, it's a global troll machine. And the BJP IT cell, very much sort of is aware of that and plays to that.
So in 2019, I believe you lost your own Twitter account, right? You had over 70,000 followers. I read about that. And then it was canceled and you were posting critical comments about Modi's administration. Can you tell us a bit more about what you think has prompted this quote cancellation and what it tells us about the hypocrisy of Western tech companies, since you talked about this outflow of money? How does this case what does it tell us? And how did you deal with this cancellation in the aftermath?
Yeah, it was close to 100,000 followers at that time for whatever it's worth.
Okay, even more. Huge following, yeah.
I think like a chunk of them weren't bots at least. So for, of course, it's a very small amount compared to, the account has an interesting story. It started as a parody account, then it became this commentary. And I never thought the account really was that important. I still don't believe it. But one of the things about the BJP and Modi is that despite all their claims that, India is a global superpower, the Hindu right represents the true power of Hinduism, and it is this reflection of this muscular Hindu identity that has been suppressed and oppressed either by Muslims or by colonized, westernized, secular, Macaulayite pseudo-intellectuals like myself and other academics. They are notoriously thin-skinned to any kind of criticism. So any joke or satire really gets under their skin. I mean, they're able to manage direct criticism a little better. So, it was just an account that I ran, and I made a joke, which was a joke poll, which referred to the fact that India's now Home Minister, I don't know if he was Home Minister then, he probably was by then, Amit Shah, he was actually imprisoned and he was under trial on grounds of murder. And he was ultimately exonerated, but it's sort of worth knowing that one judge resigned very hastily from the case. Second judge was found dead in very mysterious circumstances. And the third judge, in 15 minutes, despite a 1,000-page charge sheet, said that there was no evidence to convict Amit Shah. So there was a comment that basically made about the fact that a number of commentators felt that Modi was so invincible that the internal politics of the BJP would be his downfall. So it was sort of pun on the idea of, play on the idea of Amit Shah backstabbing him. Now, one may or may not have found that funny, but it's the kind of thing you find, it's a satirical account. It says satire and parody. It's the kind of thing that you find on The Onion all the time. And I'm not being arrogant or presumptuous enough to compare myself to The Onion. Now, a couple of times before that, the account had been very briefly either suspended or geo-blocked or something for some criticism. And I think I had just, mentioned the issue, and there had been an article about it and it had bounced back again. So my point is very simple, which is that when it suits the BJP, or when it has suited the BJP, and this still continues to sort of be the same situation today, it will allow the worst kind of abuses, threats, including threats of death, murder threats, people talking about killing other people's children. It'll say this is freedom of expression. And when it comes to any criticism of the BJP, Modi, or the Hindu right that it doesn't like, it'll then talk about a violation of community standards. And unfortunately, the big tech companies, whether it's Meta, then Facebook, or X, then Twitter, have completely played along with the BJP. They're completely pliant, and they just haven't really done what they should. They have not lived up to their professed mottos. They're completely, I think, inconsistent and unethical. And this continues even today. I should mention that I am associated with an organization called the Center for the Study of Organized Hate. And we bring out an annual hate speech report, including digital hate and online hate. And, one of the sort of key sections in that is, by their own policies, professed policies, we often show how big tech companies have significantly sort of fallen short of keeping up to what they say they will do.
Yeah, I guess, they're all free speech absolutists until the free speech harms them. And by the same token, they're not necessarily that concerned when the free speech is, in fact, doing real violence, causing real violence in India or Burma.
Absolutely. And we know that the Hindu right has, Facebook, we know, has been complicit in genocides in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. We know the Hindu right WhatsApp, for instance, also owned by the Meta Group, has been used for spreading rumors, including, rumors of child lynching or accusing Muslims of smuggling cattle. And that has led to actual violence, physical violence, lynchings. But none of that, seems to kind of bother them. And I'm a free speech absolutist, as close to it as possible. I would mention here that it's a ground on which I've been very critical of certain sections of the left as well, for instance. I don't think that you should, make apologies for the people who assassinated the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo. I don't think you should aim to shut down Charlie Hebdo. I don't think the Danish Muslim cartoon controversy, those cartoons I think they should have been published. And I think it's the same thing for Hinduism. So I think, even the sort of narrative of blasphemy laws, which all communities in India embrace, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, it's a really, really dangerous kind of idea, whether it's a minority group or a majority group that kind of puts it forward.
Rohit, I'm with you on that one with Charlie Hebdo, but where would you draw the line in terms of hate speech? Where's that line for you?
Yeah, I think that hate speech is, and it's a really good question. It's a question we grapple with, and I've gone through a number of sort of descriptions. So there's hate speech, harmful speech. There's also dangerous speech. And Susan Bennett's Dangerous Speech Project has done some wonderful work. So I think direct threats, which clearly violate the law. And I think if you can make a persuasive case that this speech is something that is directly threatening, abusing someone, or inciting people to engage in harm, that's where I would draw the line. And I would draw that line for anyone, because there are parts of India, for instance, there are regions of India where Hindus are a minority in a Muslim majority area, or Hindus might be a minority in a Christian majority area, or vice versa. Or when it comes to inter-ethnic violence between different ethnic groups, right, where the basis of rivalry is not religion, but ethnic, I think we just need to follow the same standard everywhere. So that's where I would essentially draw the line. And I think when I say draw the line, I also do include in incitement to harm. I do include dog whistling. I do include, coded threats, which are things that are very, very local context specific, which, for instance, the big tech companies completely miss out on. And they hide behind the sort of fig leaf of free speech at that point, as it were.
And shifting back to the domestic context of India, can you say a little bit about how civil society, the Congress party and other political parties are responding to Modi and the BJP? Are there challengers? Are there efforts to push back? What does that look like?
Well, it's been very poor. I'd say that, in the 10 years since Modi's been in power, it's been up and down. There have been times when at the level of states, a number of BJP state governments lost power. And every time this has happened, the Modi government has sort of pushed back. Now, a number of things have happened. Either they have politicized incidences of international conflict with Pakistan. The other thing is that every time they seem to be in threat, they crack down on dissidents or on critics further, cancelling visas of overseas citizens of India. There's a number of people. There's a student, Umar Khalid, who's been in jail forever and not been given bail. See, the idea is to really terrify people. At this point, the organs of the Indian state have been fused with those of the BJP. The BJP troll army is always on hand. And I think both the institutions of democracy, which it's not like they were entirely uncompromised during Congress rule or the rule of other parties, but they had a certain degree of autonomy to them. I think there was an understanding that you need to have some basic autonomy to be legitimate. Right now, they're indistinguishable from really arms of the BJP. And then Modi has also gone, and his government, they've also gone after civil society activists. So barring the Hindu right, no other organizations are allowed to get funding from overseas. A number of these organizations have been harassed and targeted. Educational institutions, which, regardless of the party in power, like Jawaharlal Nehru University, one of prestigious Indian university, used to always been a kind of bastion of protest and really critique of the government of the day. And students have been very outspoken against Congress policies, whether it's about the Maoist Naxalite movement or about the Congress's own history of sectarianism and so on. And, Dr. Manmohan Singh actually had gone to, I think he wanted to have a conversation with students from JNU and so on. There was never any question of shutting down, arresting students, cracking down on them. Now, many of these universities are held by puppets. And just yesterday, a number of people shared this with me. So in the last decade or so, India has had a number of private universities along the model of American-style undergraduate four-year colleges with a section of the population having made a massive sum of money since India liberalized its economy. So because government colleges, the prestigious colleges, seats are limited, there have been a number of these. So one of the most prominent universities is a university called Ashoka University. And the idea was that it's going to be a comprehensive liberal arts university. Though eventually India, with its STEM and engineering obsession, everything goes that way. Now, recently with this India-Pakistan conflict, a Muslim professor from Ashoka, had just made a couple of innocuous tweets, which were about the government of India in the name of nationalism is trotting out Muslims to echo its message, something to that effect, about pointing to the hypocrisy of the government in its treatment of Muslims at different points of time. And he mystifyingly was arrested for spreading communal discord or hate or being anti-national or something absurd. And I should again add that one of the other things the BJP has done is introduced a new kind of penal code, which is extremely draconian. So students of Ashoka and his colleagues have spoken out in his defense. And the founder, I think he's a corporate guy or some entrepreneur who made a lot of money, has come out with the most absurd article saying that, we should stay neutral and it's not for us. And if students aren't allowed to speak their mind at a university that claims to represent critical thinking, what does one even say?
It sounds a bit like a certain other country. Like what's happening here right now. We're a few steps behind, but that's what's happening. It also reminds me a lot of China. I mean, there was never much daylight between the party and the government in China, but what there was in the 90s and 2000s got completely removed under Xi Jinping. And you've seen the same thing with the sort of ideological purging of universities. Fascinating. How about the media, like not social media, but news media, journalism? What has the situation been like in terms of their ability to report and the way the government has handled them?
It's completely awful. The mainstream media is completely compromised. You might have a couple of newspapers. The Telegraph Calcutta comes to mind, and to an extent, the Hindu that still have some degree of independence. The Times group is completely compromised. The India Today group always tends to follow the government in power. But in the 90s, when I was in college, that was the era of private media or non-state media being introduced in India. And India has like the largest number of 24-hour news channels. Indians are news obsessed. But every one of these big channels, the Times now, whatever it's called, I don't watch any of them. The last one standing was something called NDTV, which got taken over by the Adanis, bought out by Adani.
Who's a very rich family and in tight with Modi.
Absolutely. His company also generates massive amounts of money despite being very thinly traded. So there was I wouldn't call it, a sort of investigator come investor, the Hindenburg Group, which had sort of pointed to some discrepancies and their share price had plummeted. And Adani is also being investigated by the SEC for a number of things and so on. And thanks to Modi, he, in part, whoever tends to own or manage ports and airports, whichever company, they tend to get raided and then Adani gets the contract a little while afterward. So the mainstream media have become complete shells for Modi. And it's sad to see that even some voices that claim to be liberal have become cheerleaders for this whole message of Indian jingoism. There's a journalist called Barkha Dutt who was seen as a pioneer in journalism. And in following this India-Pakistan conflict, it's just essentially like parroting what the Indian line is and equating it with this, uncritical loyalty towards soldiers and the army. And if you don't do it, you're a fool and this kind of stuff. But Barkha Dutt is still on the milder end of the spectrum. Some of the others have become just absolutely vicious propagandists. And many of them actually, I think, contributed to Modi's election in 2014 because they would fulminate every day. Fulminate, I never know how to pronounce that word. Fulminate every day, rave and rant. One of them in particular, Arnab Goswami, it's sort of become the source of much humor as being a screamer and yelling on TV. He made this whole sort of transition from being some kind of nominal liberal to being like a rabid, pro-Modi kind of voice. But all of them will claim they're doing objective journalism. Of course, since the Modi government has come to power, when the Congress was in power, the anger was directed towards the Congress. After the BJP has come in power, the anger is still directed towards the Congress. And Mr. Modi can do no wrong. So to give you an example, one of these channels, it was in Hindi, the day before the one-day cricket World Cup in India in 2023, there was this absurd story about, headline, Kya Modi ji jita payenge World Cup? Will Mr. Modi be able to make us win the World Cup? Anything and everything is sort of attributed to him. And then they viciously go after Modi critics. I've been invited once or twice several years ago, and I've had the good sense to say no to come on these channels. So it's a very desperate scene with televisual media, with mainstream media, even with print media. There's a couple of few online publications that are standing strong. And despite all odds, they continue to do very good work. A lot of journalists have resigned or been fired. They've started small operations or they're on YouTube channels. So that essentially is the state of media today.
And you mentioned Pakistan in your remarks just now. Could you tell us a little bit about what the state of the situation is now? How dangerous does it continue to be? Is this something you're watching closely from afar?
I am watching it, but I'm watching it from afar. And, even as far as India is concerned, I should sort of mention that one needs to be modest and one needs to understand two things. One is that, I've faced some attacks from the Hindu right. There are other people I know, friends, colleagues who've also faced attacks from the Hindu right, who are based here in the US. And I don't want to trivialize any of that for them, but it is nothing like what people in India on the ground face. And similarly, the complexities of what's happening on the ground in the border areas in India, Pakistan, and so on, or Kashmir, it's hard for us to tell. My sense, just talking to people who are better informed about this, is that there is a kind of stability right now, that we are going to see some chest thumping from both sides. I mean, there's a massive amount of nonsense and fake news and disinformation that's been generated. The center I mentioned, the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, we just brought out a report on that as well, both on the Indian side and the Pakistani side. I think it's being exploited on both sides for political control, but I think there is a piece that's kind of holding. And just watching an interview with the Indian Army Chief of Staff, I think what he was saying is that, you sort of dial it down, right? You achieve this objective, and having made your point, that is it. Like, nobody wants that kind of permanent war. So hopefully, I think India-Pakistan relations have not been in a good place, neither will they be for a while, but I don't think we will see hostilities and this kind of violence again.
Okay, Rohit, let me ask you one last question. In your latest book, The Gita for a Global World, Ethical Action in an Age of Flux, you take lessons from the Bhagavad Gita in navigating contemporary crises. Are there some lessons you could share with us that could help us navigate the authoritarian resurgence in the United States of America?
Okay, it's a big question. So there's a couple of things about, the Gita, like many texts, it has contradictions to it. For instance, I should mention that, in terms of its endorsement of a caste system, in terms of its gender politics, it is from any notions of egalitarianism or modern day standards of right, deeply problematic. That said, one of the things I suggest in the book is that we can read the Gita against the Gita. We can read it in terms of an internal tension, because there are other elements to it as well. So there's 2 or 3 points I'll make. The first is there is a message of epistemic humility in the Gita, which is about not being able to control outcomes. So there is a phrase which is not there anywhere in the Gita, but it was summed up as, it's called Nishkama Karma Yoga, which means that act in the knowledge that you cannot control outcomes, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't take action. You still have to do what's called your dharma. And in the book, I make a distinction between outcomes and what I call consequences, in the sense that we don't know what outcomes or actions will have. We cannot sort of work on the basis of this instrumental rationality, but we do know that the actions we have will have consequences, and we can keep those in mind. So I think, one, the arrogance of thinking that we can, fix something by, we have so many armchair pundits, we have so many parachute journalists, we have so many armchair academics, something I've also been accused of. And fine, I will take that hit, saying that, this is what we need to do to restore democracy. This is what we need to, do for X, Y, or Z. So I think that, rather than come up with these grand solutions, it is to practice a politics of civility, to practice a politics of inconsistency, to do what you think is your dharma, and to, essentially the other part, and just to sort of step back, is that there is a moment where one of the protagonists of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjun, whose charioteer is Lord Krishna, he has to go to war with his cousins, right? The battlefield of Kurukshetra. And he says, how can I fight against them? And Krishna tells him that it is your duty to fight against them. So there's this profound moment of self-doubt that Arjuna has. Now, if you look at the narrative in the US and Silicon Valley, or this idea that you should be decisive, you should know exactly what to do, you should take control, doubt or, reflexivity is kind of mocked. But I actually think it makes sense to have doubt. It makes sense to think very carefully about what you're going to do. And I think it makes sense to turn that lens upon yourself. I mean, you spoke earlier about the reaction of American academia. I've been in American academia for a quarter century now. I'm absolutely appalled at the hypocrisy of American academics when it comes to talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, when it comes to talking about really the genocide, when it comes to criticizing Israel. I mean, look at really prominent scholars like, Jason Stanley, Timothy Snyder, and so many others. What is happening in Palestine is a complete blind spot. One standard for Gaza, for Ukraine, one standard. Yeah, and the universities which otherwise, paint themselves out to be these bastions of free speech, there's a complete censoring and real worry and nervousness about, any kind of criticism of Israel, no matter how legitimate that is. And I really wish that these institutions would turn that eye upon themselves. To me, what's alarming then is that, what moral authority do these universities or these academics, Western academics, American academics, or Indians or Indian origin people based in India, what legitimacy do we have in criticizing the Modi government if we are absolutely tight-lipped about other things? Whether it's police brutality or whether it's what is happening in Palestine and Gaza, because we are terrified that if we criticize Israel, we won't have a job on Monday. But then we keep talking about, the Hindu right is victimizing me and so on.
But Rohit, don't you think the fear of not having a job for criticizing Israel is rather new? That
it is.
In fact, it's been the other way around in the academy until recently.
Well, I will say that I actually do know people who've lost their jobs, both for criticizing Palestine and in one case for criticizing India for its role in Kashmir. Angered someone on the Hindu right who led a campaign to have someone lose their job, tenured job. But yes, the academy till now has been one of the few spaces where you have been able to speak up for Palestinians and you have been able to be more critical of Israel. That is something I will say. But the fact that the university turned on a dime, right? Because of pressure from mega billion-dollar donors, because of indirect pressure of probably groups like APAC or, other groups or the Canary Mission or organizations that put, an arrow on academics' backs, then because of the hearings that happened of college presidents, and then, since then the Trump administration. If you don't stand for your principles at a point of time of crisis, then do you stand for those principles at all, is my question, right? But I will agree with you. I agree with you.
Okay. Well, on that note, Rohit, thank you so much. That was fascinating. It does feel very much like there are a lot of parallels between India and the United States right now. They're sort of bizarre versions of each other.
Well, there's always been this massive degree of self-congratulation India has had, world's largest democracies and so on. And by the way, Trump has had a massive constituency of support among Indians and increasingly among non-resident Indians. So they would be very delighted at what you said without the bizarro aspect of it.
You're popular over there.
Oh, very, very much so. Hindu right-wing organizations holding guns or, they look like rifles from the sort of, the Indian War of Independence or the Mutiny, whatever you call it. They have these like old rifles and they feed cardboard cutouts of Trump pieces of cake.
Oh my God.
So,
no, let's go aside.
It is. We are living in some kind of simulation sometimes. It does seem like that.
A weird video game, yeah. Well, the Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Kagra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you so much again, Rohit.
Thank you, Rohit.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.